The storm came without mercy. It rolled across Michigan's upper peninsula like a living thing, swallowing the forest in white silence, erasing roads and landmarks until the world became nothing but wind and ice and the terrible patience of winter. Snow piled against abandoned structures, against trees that had stood for 100 years, against the forgotten places where no one looked anymore. 3 miles inland from Lake Superior's frozen shore, in a collapsed wooden shed that leaned like a drunk against the wind, three German shepherds stood bound upright to timber posts. Thick ropes cinched across their chests, cutting into fur already stiff with frost. Their breathing came shallow and labored, each exhale a small cloud that vanished into the darkness. The oldest was a male they'd once called Commander. 9 years old, gray around the muzzle, his massive frame sagging under exhaustion. His amber eyes had dulled, but they were still watchful, still measuring the cold with the patience of a soldier who knew when the battle was already lost. Beside him stood Mercy, a 4-year-old female, leaner and younger, favoring her left hind leg, where the rope had rubbed her skin raw. Blood had dried dark against her pale tan fur. She did not struggle anymore. Experience had taught her that movement wasted strength, and strength was all she had left. Between them hung Hope, barely 2 years old, the youngest. Her breathing was so shallow it barely moved her ribs. Her lashes were crusted white with frost. The fine tremor in her body had stopped being fear hours ago. Now it was just cold, the kind that numbed everything, even the will to survive. They did not bark. They did not whine. The storm was supposed to finish what human cruelty had started. No one knew they were there. No one was meant to. Several miles away, in a small cabin that sat like a fist against the tree line, Nathaniel Briggs moved through rooms that had learned the shape of his silence. At 43, Nate was still broad-shouldered and solidly built, though the sharp edges of youth had been replaced by something harder, something tempered by years of service and loss. His dark hair was cut military short, threaded with early gray, that spoke less of age than of nights without sleep. His face was all angles, jaw set, cheekbones pronounced, eyes a calm steel blue that rarely betrayed what he felt. Those who knew him said he looked younger than his years until he stood still. Then the weight showed. The cabin was small. One room served as kitchen and living space. A wood stove sat in the corner, iron door open, flames crackling low. The furniture was minimal, functional, nothing that required care or attention. No photographs on the walls, no decorations, just the essentials of a man who had learned to live without needing much. Except for one thing. On the small table beside the couch sat a single framed photograph, a wedding picture. Nate in his dress blues, younger, smiling in a way he couldn't remember how to do anymore. Beside him stood Hannah Claire Briggs, dark brown hair loose around her shoulders, eyes bright with joy, one hand resting on his chest like she was feeling his heartbeat to make sure he was real. The photo was from May 2020, 4.5 years ago, a lifetime ago. Nate sat in the dimness, a glass of bourbon on the table beside him. Unopened, he'd poured it an hour ago like he did most nights, and like most nights, he wouldn't drink it. He just needed the ritual. The motion of pulling down the bottle, the sound of liquid hitting glass, the amber glow in the firelight. It was something to do with his hands. Something to keep him from thinking too hard about the fact that it was December 15th, 2024, and he'd been alone in this cabin for 16 months, and before that, he'd been alone in a different kind of silence for 6 months. And before that, Hannah had been alive. 22 months. 670 days since the phone call. He could still hear the voice of his commanding officer, calm and professional, the way it had to be when delivering news that shattered worlds. "Briggs, I need you to sit down." "Sir, I'm in the middle of—" "Sit down, petty officer." And then the words that erased everything. "Hannah was in an accident. I'm sorry, Nate, she didn't make it." February 2023. He'd been at a forward operating base somewhere in the Middle East 3 days from rotating home. 3 days. Hannah had been driving to the grocery store on an icy road in Pennsylvania, where they'd lived before his last deployment. A drunk driver crossed the median. No brakes, no time. By the time Nate got stateside, she'd already been buried 4 days. He never got to say goodbye. He came home to an empty house that still smelled like her shampoo and coffee. He finished his obligations to the Navy because finishing was what he knew how to do. Then in June 2023, he quietly retired. Early, honorably, with a bum knee and a chest full of medals he didn't want to look at anymore. In August, he'd driven north until the roads ran out, found this cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and stopped moving. Stopped everything. At his feet, lying on a wool blanket near the stove, was Stryker, a 5-year-old German shepherd, black and tan, powerfully built, without being bulky. His coat was thick for winter ears, constantly adjusting to sounds Nate couldn't hear. His eyes were dark and intelligent, carrying the alertness of a dog who had been trained to read danger before it announced itself. Stryker was not a pet. He was a military working dog, an MWD, retired from Special Operations 2 years ago after 6 years of service, explosives detection, search and rescue, casualty care. The kind of work that didn't retire from your bones just because you wore a different collar now. Nate had adopted him in October 2022 through a program for retired canines. He'd been drawn to the dog's discipline, his restraint, the way Stryker didn't need affection to function, just clear commands and consistent routine. They understood each other. Two veterans learning to live in a world that didn't need them anymore. Nate didn't baby talk Stryker, didn't call him good boy, or scratch his ears absent-mindedly. He gave commands the way he'd been trained. Scout, clear, hold, heel. And Stryker obeyed with the precision of a soldier who still remembered his job even if the war was over. Tonight, like every night, they'd done their patrol. A 2-mile loop through the tree line to check for downed branches, drifting snow, anything that might block the narrow access road. It was unnecessary. No one came out here. But routines kept the mind sharp. Routines kept you from thinking too much about the silence. They'd returned an hour ago. Nate had stoked the fire, poured the bourbon he wouldn't drink, and sat down with the weight of another day that meant nothing pressing against his chest. And then Stryker stood, not the slow stretching rise of a dog getting comfortable, but the instant snap to attention of a K9 who just detected a threat. Nate's hand moved instinctively to his thigh fingers curling where a sidearm used to rest. Old habits. There was no weapon, just the memory of needing one. Stryker's ears were locked forward, body rigid, nose working the air. His tail had dropped not in fear, but in concentration. A low sound vibrated in his chest. Not a growl, something else. A signal. Nate knew that sound. He'd heard it in Kandahar when Stryker detected an IED buried under sand. He'd heard it in Mosul when Stryker found a wounded Marine pinned under rubble. He'd heard it dozens of times over 5 years of working together in places where that sound meant life or death. It meant Stryker had found something. "What is it, boy?" Nate's voice was low, barely louder than breath. Stryker didn't look back. His gaze was fixed on the window, the one facing west, toward the deeper woods. His nostrils flared, pulling in scent carried unevenly by the wind. Nate stood slowly, crossed to the window, peeled back the heavy curtain. Nothing but white, snow falling in thick wind-driven sheets. The trees were barely visible, dark shapes dissolving into the storm. But Stryker didn't make mistakes. If he was alerting, there was a reason. Nate moved to the door, pulled on his heavy coat, laced his boots with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. He clipped a tactical flashlight to his belt, grabbed Stryker's lead, though he knew he wouldn't need it. "Scout," he said. Stryker moved immediately, pushing through the door the moment Nate opened it, turning west without hesitation. The wind hit them like a fist. Nate lowered his head, following Stryker's dark shape as the dog moved with purpose through the drifts. Not running, not wandering, moving with the deliberate focus of a K9 on mission. The forest swallowed them. Stryker didn't move in a straight line. He angled northwest, then back west, nose constantly working, reading the wind the way a sailor reads the sea. He was following scent tracking, something Nate couldn't smell, couldn't see, couldn't hear over the roar of the storm. But Nate trusted him. For 5 years, in the worst places on Earth, Stryker had never been wrong, not once. When Stryker said there was danger, there was danger. When Stryker said there were wounded, there were wounded. And tonight Stryker was saying something was out there. The cold bit through Nate's coat. His breath came hard, lungs burning as the wind cut across his face. The terrain grew rougher, trees thinning as the land sloped toward an old property line marked by rotting fence posts, half buried in snow. Nate's mind worked automatically, cataloging possibilities, dismissing most. Animal carcass, trapped deer, homeless camp. None of it felt right. Stryker's posture was too specific. This wasn't curiosity. This was recognition. Then the shed appeared. It was half buried under snow roof, sagging under the weight, one door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. An old structure, forgotten, the kind of place that should have collapsed years ago, but stubbornly refused. Stryker reached it first, circling once, hackles raised along his spine. Then he stopped at the entrance and sat body angled toward the door, staring. The signal. Target located. Nate approached carefully, boots crunching through snow. He pulled the flashlight from his belt, flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness inside the shed, and for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. 3 dogs, German shepherds, Tied upright to wooden post ropes cinched across their chests and shoulders, bodies sagging with exhaustion. For a fraction of a second, Nate didn't move. Then training took over. He crossed the space in long strides, dropping to his knees beside the first dog, the oldest, Commander. The rope was thick, industrial-grade, knotted with precision. Not the sloppy work of someone in a hurry. These were deliberate knots tied to hold weight without killing quickly. Nate pulled his knife, a fixed blade he'd carried since his first deployment, and cut the rope in 2 quick motions. He eased the dog down, carefully supporting the weight so joints didn't collapse. Commander sagged against him, a soft sound escaping his throat that might have been relief or just the body giving up. The second dog, Mercy, flinched when Nate cut her free, but didn't fight. Her eyes tracked his movements, sharp and intelligent, waiting to see if this new human would hurt her too. The third dog, Hope, barely reacted at all. Nate wrapped his coat around her, pressing his gloved hand against her chest. The heartbeat was there, faint and fluttering, the rhythm of a body fighting its last fight. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he didn't know if she could hear. Stryker stepped closer, positioning himself between the open door and the fragile cluster on the floor. Guard posture, protecting the vulnerable. It was what K9s were trained to do. Casualty care, stay with the wounded until help arrived. Except this time, Nate was the help. He pulled 2 chemical warmers from his pack, the kind he always carried for winter patrols, and slid them beneath Hope's body, one near her core, careful not to shock her system with too much heat too fast. Hypothermia killed in stages. You had to bring them back slowly. He checked Mercy's leg, found the raw skin where Rope had cut deep, and wrapped it with gauze from the small med kit he kept clipped to his belt. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She'd survive if he got her warm. Commander's eyes never left Nate's face. There was something in that gaze, something Nate recognized. The look of a soldier who'd been through hell and learned not to hope for rescue, but was too disciplined to give up. Nate met his eyes. "I got you," he said quietly. "You're not dying here." The storm howled outside, indifferent, relentless. But inside the shed, something had shifted. Nate gathered Hope into his arms, cradling her like she might shatter. Stryker moved first, clearing the doorway, ears rotating, body, a quiet promise of violence held in check. "Home," Nate said. Stryker turned into the wind without hesitation. The walk back was brutal. Nate carried Hope against his chest, her weight almost nothing, frighteningly light. Behind him, Commander and Mercy followed, stubborn heads down against the wind. Mercy limped, but she didn't stop. Commander moved like a machine, running on fumes each step, deliberate, refusing to quit. Halfway through the trees, Mercy stumbled. Nate stopped, shifted Hope's weight, and caught Mercy with his free arm. He murmured something he didn't even know what just sounds meant to be reassuring. Mercy leaned into him for 3 seconds, then pushed forward again. Stryker glanced back once, checking, then continued, choosing the safest path through the drifts. When the cabin finally emerged from the white, Nate felt something in his chest loosen. Just a fraction. Just enough to let air back in. He shouldered the door open, and warmth hit him like a physical thing. Wood smoke and dry cedar and the faint metallic tang of the stove. Stryker entered first, circling the room once, then returning to Hope, and pressing close his body, a wall of heat that didn't ask permission. Nate laid Hope down nearest the hearth on layered blankets, then guided Commander into place with one arm braced under the old dog's ribcage so he wouldn't collapse too hard. Mercy came last, limping, but refusing to be carried once she found her footing. Nate knelt and began the slow work that didn't look heroic. He peeled off frozen rope fibers still stuck to fur, checked for swelling, listened to breathing patterns, counted heartbeats, measured core temperatures with the small digital thermometer he kept in his pack. The fire was already burning moderate, not roaring. You couldn't force warmth too fast into a body that had started shutting down. Shock could kill as easily as cold. He slid chemical warmers beneath each dog's blanket. Near the core, letting heat spread gradually, he poured warm water into a shallow bowl and offered it first to Commander, who drank slowly, then Mercy, then held a few drops to Hope's lips. Hope didn't drink at first. Her eyes were closed, lashes crusted with frost, breathing shallow and uneven. Nate's hand hovered over her chest, feeling that fragile flutter of pulse that made anger and fear twist together behind his ribs. He'd carried teammates through cold nights in places whose names he couldn't say. He'd watched some of them live and others slip away despite everything he did. He hated that this felt the same. Hated that he cared this much after promising himself he wouldn't care about anything ever again. Stryker adjusted position, placing his chin lightly across Hope's forehead, his breath warming her fur. Nate sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly. He could do this. He could keep them alive. But his mind betrayed him, drifting to another winter, another life when he'd come home to a house in Pennsylvania that still smelled like Hannah's coffee and learned that the person who made that house a home was gone. Hannah had been the kind of woman who warmed a room just by walking into it. Medium height, soft-shouldered skin that freckled under summer sun. Dark brown hair she kept loose when she was happy and tied back when she was working. She used to tease him for folding towels with military corners, for lining his boots up by the door in perfect formation. Then she'd kiss his cheek like his discipline was something lovable instead of exhausting. When she died on that icy road in February 2023, Nate had felt something inside him shut like a door slammed in a storm. He'd finished his service because finishing was what he knew how to do, but he'd stopped making plans beyond the next day. Stopped letting people close enough to matter. Grief became a private language he spoke fluently with no audience. And now in the firelight, with 3 battered dogs breathing in uneven rhythms, Nate felt that locked door strain on its hinges. Caring was dangerous. Caring invited loss. But Stryker lay pressed against hope like he'd never heard of such a rule. His ears flicked once toward the window, then settled. His eyes stayed steady, dark, unblinking in their loyalty. Stryker had come from a rescue with a history Nate hadn't been told much about. Just that the bomb had been abandoned after service, left at a shelter when his handler didn't want him anymore. Stryker had learned to rely on himself the way soldiers did when the system failed them. Nate had recognized that survival immediately. It was the same survival that had kept him upright after Hannah. Maybe that's why they fit. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint rattle against the porch. Loose chain, hanging shovel. Something small that sounded bigger in the storm. Mercy flinched. Commander's head lifted a fraction. Stryker's body tightened, but he didn't move away from hope. Nate stood, went to the window, peeled back the curtain just enough to see the yard. White emptiness, no headlights, no shapes moving in the dark. But the unease remained. The shed hadn't been far. Maybe a mile and a half. Whoever had tied those dogs there might be close enough to notice tracks if the storm didn't erase them fast enough. Nate's jaw clenched. He crossed to the door, checked the deadbolt, made sure it slid smoothly. Then he reached for the old, handheld radio he kept for weather updates. Static hissed, then crackled. Then a distant voice warned of worsening conditions and advised residents to stay indoors. Nate turned the volume down, not wanting the noise to disturb the fragile calm. He returned to the hearth and sat on the floor back against the couch, watching the torrent as if observation itself could protect them. Commander finally lowered his head, not fully sleeping, but resting. His breathing evened out, slow and deep. Mercy's posture softened by degrees. Pain still present, but no longer ruling her. Stryker adjusted again, placing his chin across Hope's forehead, breath warming her fur with steady patience. Minutes passed, then Hope's eyelids fluttered. At first, Nate thought it was involuntary, just the body's reflex. But then her eyes opened. Dark, glassy, unfocused at first, then slowly tracking the room until they found him. She did not bare teeth. She did not try to crawl away. She simply looked at him. And in that look, there was no fear, only a question so quiet it felt sacred. "Are you real?" Nate leaned forward, careful not to crowd her, his voice softer than he intended. "Hey," he whispered, "you're okay. You're safe now." Hope blinked once slowly, and her gaze shifted to Stryker as if confirming the warmth beside her wasn't a dream, then back to Nate as if choosing to believe. Something in Nate's chest loosened, just a thread, just enough to let air back in. He stayed there through the night, checking pulses, adjusting blankets, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed, but knew they needed to hear. At some point, exhaustion pulled him under. Not sleep exactly, just the soldier's ability to rest while staying aware, one part of his brain still on watch. When pale light finally seeped through the windows, thinning the darkness, Nate woke to find all 3 dogs breathing steadily. Commander's eyes were half open, the old vigilance refusing full surrender. Mercy slept curled with her injured leg supported. Hope's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that was stronger now, steadier. Stryker still hadn't moved from his post. Nate stood slowly, joints stiff from sitting on the floor all night. He crossed to the kitchen, started coffee, stared out the window at the aftermath of the storm. The world was white and still, beautiful in the way dangerous things often are. But Nate wasn't looking at the beauty. He was thinking about the rope. Military-grade paracord 550, rated the kind used for tactical ops. The knots had been precise, practiced tied, with the kind of efficiency that came from training or repetition. Someone had done this before, and someone needed to answer for it. Nate pulled his phone from the charging dock, scrolled through the short list of contacts, he'd allowed himself to keep. Most were old Navy buddies he never called. A few local numbers for emergencies. He found the one labeled Vet Harlow. Charlotte Harlow. He'd met her once briefly 6 months ago when Stryker had needed a checkup. She was older, late 60s, calm and competent, the kind of person who didn't waste words. Nate hesitated for only a second. Then he dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered, warm and steady. Harlow Veterinary, this is Charlie. Ma'am, Nate said, his voice still rough from not speaking all night. This is Nathaniel Briggs. I need veterinary assistance. 3 German shepherds. Hypothermia, suspected abuse. There was a pause. Not hesitation, just the silence of someone shifting gears. How severe? Stable now, but they need a professional. Address, he gave it. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Nate set the phone down, poured coffee he didn't drink, and returned to the dogs. Hope was awake now, watching him with eyes that were clearer, more focused. She still didn't move, but her tail twitched once when he knelt beside her. Someone's coming to help, Nate said quietly. Someone who knows what they're doing. He didn't know if she understood, but she kept looking at him like she did, like she believed him. And for the first time in 22 months, Nate felt the dangerous, terrifying pull of responsibility settle over him like a weight he'd thought he'd never carry again. He thought of Hannah's eyes in that photograph, the way she used to look at him when he came home from deployment, like she was memorizing his face to make sure he was real. He thought of the way Hope had looked at him just hours ago, asking the same silent question. Are you real? Nate exhaled slowly, resting one hand on Hope's head, feeling the warmth returning to her body. Yeah, he whispered. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside Nathaniel Briggs, something had broken open. And for the first time since Hannah died, he didn't try to close it. Breaking the silence. Charlotte Harlow arrived in a weathered Ford pickup that had seen more Michigan winters than most. She stepped out carrying her veterinary case, moving with the quiet efficiency Nate remembered from their first meeting 6 months ago. Today, though, there was something different in her expression. Not just professional concern, but personal investment. Nate met her at the door. She greeted him with a brief nod, nothing wasted, then knelt immediately beside the dogs without waiting for invitation. She let them sniff her gloves first, reading posture and breath before touching. Commander accepted her with the dignity of an elder. Mercy watched her hands carefully measuring intent. Hope stirred, slightly reassured by Stryker's presence beside her. Charlie worked methodically, checking circulation, palpating Mercy's injured leg, listening to lungs with a stethoscope she pulled from her case. She moved with the kind of precision that came from 40 years of practice, her hands sure and gentle. After 10 minutes, she sat back on her heels and nodded once. You did right, she said, as if stating weather. Slow warming support observation. Exactly what they needed. Nate felt a small release at that. Not praise, just confirmation that he hadn't failed them. Charlie unwrapped Mercy's leg with practiced care, examined the raw flesh where rope had cut deep, and cleaned it with antiseptic that made Mercy flinch but not pull away. She rewrapped it with proper medical gauze, securing it with tape that wouldn't slip. This leg will heal, Charlie said, but it's going to hurt for a while. Keep her off it as much as possible. No running for at least 2 weeks. She moved to Hope, next checking the young dog's core temperature with a digital thermometer, listening to her heart, examining her eyes for signs of neurological damage from prolonged cold exposure. She's the lucky one, Charlie said quietly. Another hour and we'd be having a different conversation. Nate didn't respond. He was watching Charlie's hands, the way they moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating, never rough. It reminded him of the medics he'd worked with overseas, people who'd seen enough suffering to know exactly how to ease it. When Charlie finished her examination, she stood and gestured toward the kitchen table. We should talk. They sat across from each other with mugs of coffee Nate had poured, but neither of them drank. Outside, morning light made the snow glare white and clean, erasing the violence of the night before. Where did you find them? Charlie asked. Old shed, about 1.5 miles west of here. They were tied to posts, rope across the chest, knotted tight. Charlie's mouth tightened, not in anger, in recognition. What kind of rope? Paracord, 550 rated, military grade. And the knots, precise, practiced, someone who knew what they were doing. Charlie set her mug down carefully, her eyes distant for a moment, like she was looking at something Nate couldn't see. Breeders who shut down fast leave messes, she said. Sometimes the messes are still alive. You've seen this before. It wasn't a question. Charlie met his gaze, and for the first time since arriving, the professional mask slipped. What lay beneath was older, deeper. Not fresh grief, but the kind that had scarred over without fully healing. Not exactly this, she said, but close enough to recognize the pattern. She stood cross to the window, looked out at the white expanse of forest. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but Nate could hear the weight of years pressing against each word. My husband Richard died 7 years ago this January, she said. Heart attack. He was 61. Too young, but not unexpected. He'd had problems for years. Weak heart, the doctor said. Stress didn't help. Nate waited. He knew the shape of grief well enough to recognize when someone was working up to the hard part. Charlie turned back to face him, arms folded loosely across her chest. But what made it unbearable was knowing that the stress killing him came from something preventable, something cruel and calculated. She returned to the table, sat down, and this time she did take a sip of coffee. 2017. February 14th, actually. Valentine's Day. Richard bought me a German Shepherd puppy as a gift. He knew I'd always wanted one, but we'd never had time with the clinic keeping us so busy. He said we were getting older, slowing down, maybe it was time. A faint smile crossed her face there and gone. Richard bought the puppy from a breeder up near Marquette. High-end operation or so it seemed. Kruger Premium Kennels. They had a fancy website, testimonials, championship bloodlines. They charged $4,500 for a puppy with full health guarantees and lifetime support. Charlie's jaw tightened. We named him Kaiser. Beautiful animal. Smart, loyal, everything you'd want in a German Shepherd. Richard fell completely in love. I'd never seen him so happy, not in 30 years of marriage. He'd come home from the clinic and spend hours training Kaiser, walking him, just sitting with him. She paused, staring into her coffee like it held answers. 3 months later, May 20th, Kaiser collapsed during a walk, just dropped mid-stride. We rushed him to the emergency vet. I knew before they told us. I've been a veterinarian for 43 years. I know what a dying animal looks like. Her voice stayed level, factual, but Nate could hear the effort it took. Congenital heart defect, severe septal abnormality, something that should have been caught in any responsible breeder's health screening. The kind of defect you can detect with a simple echocardiogram before breeding. Kaiser died on the table. He was 5 months old. Nate felt anger stirring in his chest, the clean kind that sharpened focus. Richard was devastated, Charlie continued, but he was also a veterinarian. He knew this wasn't just bad luck. This was negligence, maybe worse. The contract Kruger had us sign promised full health guarantee money back if any genetic issues appeared within the first year. Let me guess, Nate said. He refused to honor it. Worse, Vincent Kruger accused us of causing Kaiser's death. Said we must have overfed him, overworked him, exposed him to toxins. Anything to avoid responsibility. When Richard pushed back, showed him the necropsy report, proving congenital defect, Kruger threatened to sue us for defamation. Charlie's hands tightened around her mug. Richard couldn't let it go. Not because of the money, we didn't need that. But because he knew if Kruger was breeding dogs with heart defects, there would be others. Other families, other children falling in love with puppies that were born to die young. She looked directly at Nate. Richard tried to do the right thing. Filed complaints with the state, tried to get Kruger's breeding license reviewed. But Kruger had lawyers, good ones. They dragged everything out for months. Filed countersuits claiming Richard was damaging their business reputation. The legal fees piled up. The stress got worse. Her voice finally wavered. December 2017. Richard had his first major heart attack. Survived, but he was never the same after. Weak, tired all the time. But he still wouldn't drop the case against Kruger. Said it was about principle now, about protecting others. Charlie took a shaky breath. January 9th, 2018. Second heart attack. That one killed him. I found him in his office at the clinic, surrounded by paperwork from the Kruger case. He died trying to do the right thing. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the soft breathing of sleeping dogs and the whisper of wind against windows. I couldn't prove Vincent Kruger killed my husband, Charlie said. But I know the stress did, and I know Kruger caused that stress deliberately, maliciously to protect his business. For 7 years, I've carried that knowing. Watching him continue his operation, selling more dogs, seeing his trucks around town, knowing what kind of man he really was, and being powerless to stop him. She met Nate's eyes, and he saw something there he recognized. The particular rage that came from injustice. You couldn't fix wrongs. You couldn't set right loss that demanded accounting, but received none. When you called this morning, Charlie said, and told me about 3 German shepherds tied up and left to die, I knew. I knew it was him. Because a man who valued profit over life 7 years ago doesn't suddenly grow a conscience. And those knots you described, that military-grade rope, that level of planning, it all points to someone who's done this before, someone systematic. Nate absorbed this in silence, feeling the weight of her 7-year burden settling onto his own shoulders. He understood what she was really saying. This wasn't just about 3 dogs. This was about finishing something her husband had started, about justice delayed but not forgotten. You think he's been disposing of dogs like this for years, Nate said. I think, Charlie said carefully, that someone running a breeding operation eventually ends up with animals that don't meet standards. Dogs with health issues, behavioral problems, or just too old to breed anymore. And I think someone like Vincent Kruger, who cares more about profit than life, would see those animals as liabilities rather than responsibilities. She leaned forward. Richard found evidence near the end. Records showing Kruger had registered over 300 puppies through the Kennel Club in 5 years. But when Richard cross-referenced with veterinary records and microchip databases, he could only account for about 260. 40 dogs, maybe more, just disappeared from the records. What happened to them? Richard never found out. He died before he could finish the investigation. But I've thought about those missing dogs every day for 7 years. Wondered where they went, how they died, whether anyone was there at the end, or if they died alone and afraid. Charlie's voice steadied again, sliding back into the professional tone she wore like armor. I can't prove anything yet, she said. But I'd like to help you try, because maybe this time someone like Vincent Kruger doesn't get to walk away. Maybe this time there's actually consequences. Nate studied her face, saw the quiet determination there, the patience of someone who'd learned to wait for the right moment, but never forgot what she was waiting for. Why now, he asked. After 7 years, why is this the moment? Charlie smiled faintly. It wasn't a happy expression. Because 7 years ago I was alone. A widow with no leverage and no one willing to stand up to a man with money and lawyers. The sheriff's department listened politely and did nothing. The state veterinary board investigated and found insufficient evidence. Everyone told me to let it go, move on, except that sometimes bad things happen and there's no justice. She gestured toward the sleeping dogs. But you're different, Nathaniel. You didn't find 3 dying dogs and call animal control. You brought them home. You sat up all night keeping them alive. You called me for help even though you barely know me. You're not afraid, and more importantly, you care. That's rare. Rarer than you think. Nate wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't brave, just angry, that he didn't care, he just couldn't walk away, that this wasn't heroism, just the inability to turn his back on suffering because he'd seen too much of it overseas and failed to stop it there. But he didn't say any of that, because it would have been a lie. The truth was simpler and more frightening. He did care. For the first time in 22 months, he cared about something beyond his own grief. And caring meant vulnerability. It meant opening himself up to loss again. It meant choosing to feel in a world that seemed designed to punish feeling. But looking at Commander's gray muzzle, at Mercy's watchful eyes, at Hope's fragile trust, he realized caring was no longer optional. It had already happened. The sound of tires on snow interrupted his thoughts. Nate stood, moved to the window, saw a sheriff's cruiser easing into the clearing. No lights, but the presence was unmistakable. Deputy Ellison Grant stepped out, and Nate recognized the look on his face. It was the expression of a man who'd seen something that made him angry, but knew he had to stay professional. Nate opened the door before Ellison knocked. Mr. Briggs, Ellison said with a nod, got your message. Heard you found some dogs in rough shape. Come in. Ellison entered, removing his hat, nodding respectfully to Charlie. Mrs. Harlow, didn't expect to see you here. The dogs needed medical attention, Charlie said simply, and I have a personal interest in cases involving Kruger kennels. Something flickered in Ellison's expression. Recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement that small towns had long memories. He knelt beside the 3 German shepherds, his face tightening as he took in their condition. He didn't touch them, just observed the way cops learn to assess a scene without contaminating it. How bad, he asked Charlie. They'll live, but another few hours in that shed, and we'd be documenting deaths instead of injuries. Ellison stood, pulled a small notebook from his pocket, clicked his pen with the automatic gesture of someone who'd taken 10,000 statements. Walk me through it, Mr. Briggs, from the beginning. Nate kept it brief and factual. The storm, Stryker's alert behavior, following his K9 into the woods, finding the shed, the way the dogs had been tied rope across the chest, knotted to posts positioned to maximize suffering while minimizing the chance of strangulation. He described the paracord, the military-grade quality, the precision of the knots. He explained his background, how he recognized the rope and the technique from his time in the SEALs, how this wasn't amateur work or panicked abandonment. This was methodical, practiced, intentional. When he finished, Ellison was quiet for a moment, tapping his pen against the notebook in a rhythm that suggested he was thinking hard. "You still have the rope?" he finally asked. "Bagged in, labeled. Figured you might want it." "Good thinking." Ellison made a note. "And the location, you can show me the exact spot. Soon as the roads are clear enough, I can take you there this afternoon if you want." Ellison nodded, then looked at the dogs again. His jaw was tight, the muscles working like he was chewing on something bitter. "We've had complaints about Kruger kennels before," he said, and there was frustration in his voice. 6 formal reports over the last 5 years. Neglect, unsanitary conditions, aggressive sales tactics, possible fraud. But Michigan law treats dogs as property, not living beings. Makes prosecution difficult when you're essentially arguing about damaged goods rather than suffering creatures. "What would it take?" Nate asked. "To prosecute, I mean. What evidence would you need?" Ellison flipped back through his notebook, found something, tapped it with his pen. "Proof of intent to harm, not just neglect or poor care, but deliberate intentional cruelty. That's a felony under Michigan law. But it's hard to prove unless you catch someone in the act or have clear documentation of systematic abuse." Charlie spoke up, her voice sharp with the precision of someone who'd thought about this problem for 7 years. "What about the rope, military-grade paracord precision knots, 3 dogs tied in a way that maximized suffering without immediate death? That's not accidental, that's calculated." "I agree," Ellison said. "But a good lawyer, and Kruger has very good lawyers, will argue the dogs were released humanely and somehow got tangled in old equipment, or that someone else tied them after Kruger released them. They'll create reasonable doubt. We need more than just the scene. We need pattern. We need to show this isn't a one-time mistake, but ongoing, systematic disposal of unwanted animals." Nate felt frustration rising, the old combat instinct that wanted simple solutions to complex problems. Overseas, there were enemies and allies, threats and civilians. Here, evil wore suits and hid behind lawyers, and the law protected property more than it protected life. "So he just gets away with it," Nate said, and he couldn't quite keep the edge from his voice. "I didn't say that." Ellison met his eyes, and Nate saw something there. A quiet understanding, a shared frustration with systems that move too slowly for justice. "I said we need more evidence, and I'm willing to help you find it. Unofficially." There was weight to that last word, an acknowledgement that sometimes the law had to work around itself to serve actual justice. "What do you need from me?" Nate asked. "Document everything. Photographs with timestamps, measurements, physical evidence properly collected and stored. I'll open an official investigation, but I need a case strong enough that the prosecutor can't ignore it and Kruger's lawyers can't tear it apart. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good." Ellison tucked his notebook away, settled his hat back on his head. "I'll file the initial report today. In the meantime, those dogs stay with you. If Kruger comes around asking for them, you call me immediately. Don't engage, don't argue, just call." He moved toward the door, then paused, turned back. "And Mr. Briggs, one more thing. Be careful. Vincent Kruger is not someone who takes kindly to interference. He's got money connections and a mean streak. If he finds out you're building a case against him, he might push back. Hard." Nate's expression didn't change. "I've dealt with worse." Ellison studied him for a moment, and Nate could see the deputy making calculations, weighing what kind of man stood in front of him. What he saw must have been sufficient, because he nodded once. "I imagine you have," Ellison said. "Just remember, this isn't a war zone. We do things by the book here, slowly, carefully, so it sticks." "Understood." After Ellison left Charing, and Nate sat in silence for a while. The dogs slept peacefully, their breathing steady and deep. Stryker had finally relaxed his guard posture, though he remained close to Hope, their connection already forming into something that looked like family. "What happens now?" Charlie asked. Nate looked at the 3 dogs who'd survived the night, then at Stryker, who'd refused to ignore their suffering, then out the window at the forest that had almost become their grave. "Now I go back to that shed," he said, "and I find out everything I can about who did this and why." Charlie stood gathering her medical supplies with practiced efficiency. "I'm coming with you." "You don't have to." "I know." She met his eyes, and the determination there was absolute. "But I've been waiting 7 years for this chance. I'm not sitting on the sidelines now." Nate understood. This wasn't just about 3 dogs for Charlie. This was about finishing what Richard had started. about proving that persistence mattered, that eventually the scales could balance, that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. All right, he said, we go together. The next morning, December 17th, dawned cold and brilliantly clear. The kind of winter day that made the world look like it had been carved from ice and diamond, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Nate and Charlie returned to the shed with Stryker leading the way. The storm had passed, leaving everything crystalline and still. Their breath made clouds in the frozen air, and the snow crunched beneath their boots with the particular sound of deep cold. The shed looked different in daylight, more pathetic than sinister. Just a collapsing structure that should have been demolished years ago, rotting wood and rusted metal, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But it had almost succeeded as a tomb. That made it sacred in a terrible way. Nate photographed everything methodically. The post where the dogs had been tied, the rope fragments still visible, frozen into place. The angles, the placement, the way someone would have had to work deliberately to secure three struggling animals in this specific configuration. This wasn't panic, this wasn't impulse. This was planned execution. Stryker moved around the perimeter nose, working the cold air. Then he stopped behind the shed and sat body rigid, staring at the ground. The signal. Target located. Nate approached carefully, knelt in the snow, began brushing it away with gloved hands. His fingers found something solid beneath the white. He kept digging, slowly preserving what he found. Not one grave, not 7, 12. Small mounds arranged in 2 neat rows, evenly spaced, covered with old snow that had compacted over months, maybe years. Some had pieces of wood stuck in the ground like crude markers, names and dates, long since weathered away. But on one partially buried scrap of vinyl, faded lettering was still visible: KPK, Kruger Premium Kennels. Charlie stood beside him, her face pale in the morning light, but her voice steady. 12, she whispered. 12 dogs he threw away like garbage. Nate pulled out his phone, began documenting. Wide shots establishing the scene. Close-ups of each grave. Measurements of spacing. The vinyl scrap photographed from multiple angles, the letters K, P, K, clear enough to be admissible evidence. This isn't neglect, he said quietly, more to himself than to Charlie. This is systematic disposal. This is a man who decided living beings were cheaper to bury than to care for. They worked for 2 hours in the bitter cold, their fingers going numb despite heavy gloves. When they finally had everything documented, Nate stood and looked at the 12 graves, thinking about the dogs buried there. Thinking about families who might have loved them, who might still be wondering what happened to the puppy they bought and lost too soon. We need to tell Ellison, Charlie said. We need to do more than that. Nate turned to her. We need to find out who these dogs were. If even one of them can be identified, connected back to Kruger's breeding records, we can prove this has been happening for years. That will mean excavating, Charlie said quietly. Disturbing them. I know. Nate looked at the graves again. I don't like it either. But if we don't, Kruger walks. And everything they suffered, everything they endured, it means nothing. Charlie was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. Let's call Ellison. Do this right, with witnesses and proper documentation. So when we go to court, there's no question about chain of evidence. That afternoon, they returned to the shed with Deputy Ellison and the county medical examiner, who reluctantly agreed to treat animal remains with the same forensic care given to human cases. What they found in those first 6 graves would be enough to break the case wide open. But that discovery and everything that followed would have to wait. Because as they worked in the cold behind the shed, carefully excavating graves and documenting evidence, Vincent Kruger was making plans of his own. Plans that would force everything to a crisis point faster than anyone expected. Plans that would test whether the law could move quickly enough to protect the vulnerable from men who saw them as nothing more than property to be disposed of. The second watch had begun, and the darkness was pushing back. The second watch begins. December 18th arrived with the peculiar silence that follows a storm, the world scrubbed clean and waiting. Nate woke before dawn from a sleep that hadn't quite been rest, his mind already running through the evidence they'd collected, the case they were building, the confrontation he knew was coming. Commander was awake too, sitting near the hearth with the patient vigilance of an old soldier who'd learned that safety was never permanent. Their eyes met across the dim room, and Nate felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a familiar coat. These dogs were his now, not just in the legal sense that would come later, but in the deeper way that mattered. He'd chosen them, and they'd chosen him back, and that bond carried obligations he was only beginning to understand. He made coffee, checked on Mercy, and Hope found both sleeping peacefully. Stryker raised his head from his post beside Hope, acknowledged Nate with a glance, then settled back into watchfulness. The canine hadn't fully relaxed since the rescue, maintaining some part of himself, always on duty, always ready. Nate understood that completely. The sound of an engine broke the morning quiet. Not the steady rumble of a truck belonging to someone with business here, but something else. Something that made Stryker's ears snap forward and Commander rise to his feet. Nate moved to the window and felt his jaw tighten. Vincent Kruger's faded blue pickup sat in the clearing, exhaust blooming white in the cold air. As Nate watched the driver's door open and Kruger climbed out, followed by a second man from a sleek sedan that had pulled up behind him. The second man was older, well-dressed, despite the rural setting, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Nate's truck. Everything about him said lawyer, and expensive lawyers at that. Nate stepped onto the porch, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could hear if the dogs needed him. The cold bit through his thermal shirt, but he didn't reach for his coat. This wouldn't take long. Kruger stopped 10 feet from the porch, and up close in daylight, Nate could read him better. 6'2", heavy through the middle, the kind of size that had been strength once but was turning soft. His beard was patchy, his eyes hard and calculating beneath the knit cap. He wore a new Carhartt jacket, stiff and unbroken, the kind of thing bought to project an image rather than earn through work. "Those dogs," Kruger called, his voice pitched for confidence that didn't quite land. "They're mine. You got no right keeping them." Nate didn't move, didn't react. Just stood there with the patience he'd learned in 100 stakeouts, letting the silence do its work. The lawyer stepped forward, smooth and professional. "Mr. Briggs, my name is Mitchell Thorne. I represent Mr. Kruger. We're here to discuss the matter of his property that you're currently holding without authorization." "The dogs aren't property," Nate said quietly. "They're living beings, and I'm not holding them. I rescued them from dying in a blizzard." "Actually," Thorne said, pulling papers from his briefcase with practiced efficiency, "under Michigan law, dogs are legally classified as personal property. And my client has documentation proving ownership of the 3 German Shepherds currently in your possession." He held out a stack of papers. Nate descended the steps, slowly took them, scanned the contents with the kind of attention to detail the Navy had drilled into him. Registration forms from the American Kennel Club. Microchipping records from a national pet recovery database. All 3 dogs, Commander Mercy and Hope, though listed under different names, registered to Kruger Premium Kennels with dates going back to 2022. The paperwork was legitimate. That was the problem. Furthermore, Thorne continued, his tone remaining professionally pleasant. "Mr. Kruger filed proper business closure documentation with the Michigan Department of Agriculture in September of this year. As part of that process, he submitted the required animal disposition report, including a wildlife release form, indicating that all breeding stock not sold or transferred was humanely released to appropriate natural habitats per Michigan wildlife reintroduction protocols." Nate looked at the release form. The narrative was smooth, bureaucratic, designed to sound responsible. 12 adult German Shepherds released to natural habitat areas where prey availability and shelter were confirmed suitable for canine survival. The date on the form was December 18, 2024, 3 days after Nate had pulled 3 dying dogs from that shed. "This is dated after the fact," Nate said, keeping his voice level. "I found those dogs on December 15th. This form claims they were released in September, but it wasn't filed until December 18th, 3 days ago." "An administrative delay," Thorne replied without missing a beat. "The release occurred when the business closed in September. The paperwork was filed later due to backlog at the state office. Perfectly legal and not uncommon with business closures." Kruger spoke up, emboldened by his lawyer's presence. "I did everything by the book. Closed the business proper, filed all the forms, released the dogs I couldn't sell to places they could survive. What happened after that ain't my responsibility. Maybe they wandered into that shed on their own. Maybe somebody else tied them up. Either way, they're still my property and I want them back." Nate looked past the lawyer to Kruger, and something in his expression made the bigger man take an unconscious step backward. "You tied them to posts with military-grade paracord," Nate said quietly. "Precision knots designed to hold weight without causing immediate strangulation. You positioned them to maximize suffering while extending the timeline of death. You left them to freeze in a blizzard because it was cheaper than euthanasia and cleaner than a bullet." "Prove it," Thorne said, stepping smoothly between them. "Prove my client personally restrained those animals. Prove he intended harm rather than humane release. You can't. What you can prove is that you removed property belonging to Mr. Kruger without his knowledge or permission." The lawyer's expression hardened, the pleasant mask dropping away to reveal something colder underneath. "You have 48 hours to return the animals, Mr. Briggs. If you fail to comply, we will pursue criminal charges for theft of property valued at over $13,000. That's felony level in Michigan. We will also file a civil suit for damages to Mr. Kruger's reputation and business interests. Do you understand the position you're in? Nate met Thorne's eyes and saw a man who'd spent his career making problems disappear for clients who could pay. A man who knew exactly how guilty his client was and didn't care because guilt and innocence were just variables in an equation that always ended with billable hours. 48 hours, Nate said quietly, until December 20th. Correct. Thorne tucked his papers away with the satisfied air of someone who'd just won. We'll return at 10 a.m. on the 20th to collect Mr. Kruger's property. I trust you'll have them ready for transfer. They walked back to their vehicles, Kruger throwing one last look over his shoulder, half triumph, half something that might have been fear, before climbing into his truck. Nate stood on the porch until both vehicles disappeared down the access road, until the sound of engines faded into the usual forest quiet. Then he went inside, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Charlie Harlow answered on the second ring. They just left, Nate said. Kruger and his lawyer. They're demanding the dogs back in 48 hours or they'll press charges. Can they do that? Legally, maybe. The paperwork looks legitimate even if the timeline doesn't add up. Without proof that the release form was backdated, we're stuck arguing possession versus ownership. There was silence on the line, then Charlie's voice came back harder, more determined. Then we find the proof. Ellison said he'd help. Let's call him, get him involved officially before Kruger's lawyers can muddy the waters any further. Already on it, Nate said. But Charlie, this might get complicated. If you want to step back. Don't, she cut him off. Don't give me an out. I've been waiting 7 years for someone to stand up to Vincent Kruger. I'm not backing down now because things got difficult. Nate felt something loosen in his chest. Not quite relief, but the recognition that he wasn't alone in this fight. I'll call Ellison, he said. Meet me here in an hour. We need a plan. Deputy Ellison Grant arrived 30 minutes later with the kind of focused energy that suggested he'd been waiting for this call. He listened to Nate's account of the confrontation, examined the paperwork Thorne had provided, and spent a long moment staring at the December 18th date on the wildlife release form. This is wrong, Ellison said finally. I can feel it, but feeling isn't evidence. What if we could prove the form was created after the fact, Nate asked. Would that be enough? It would help. It would show consciousness of guilt that Kruger knew what he did was illegal and tried to manufacture a paper trail to cover it. But how do you prove when a document was created versus when it was filed? Metadata, Charlie said. She'd arrived minutes after Ellison, and now she leaned forward over the kitchen table where they'd spread the documents. Every digital file has metadata. Creation, date, modification, date, author, information. If Kruger or his lawyer created that form on December 18th and backdated it to September, the metadata would show it. Ellison's eyes sharpened. The state filing system is digital. Everything submitted goes through an online portal. If I can get a warrant for the server records. Listen, can you get one? Nate asked. On what grounds? Suspected fraud in official documentation related to an ongoing animal cruelty investigation. Ellison was already pulling out his phone. Judge Morrison owes me a favor. She loves dogs more than she loves people. Give me an hour. He stepped outside to make the call, leaving Nate and Charlie alone with the evidence spread across the table and 3 dogs sleeping peacefully, unaware of the legal battle being fought over their lives. What if it's not enough? Charlie asked quietly. What if we prove the fraud, but it's still not enough to keep them safe? Nate looked at Commander at the gray muzzle and patient eyes at the dignity this old dog had maintained even in the worst moments. Then we find another way, he said. I'm not letting them go back. Charlie studied his face, reading something there that made her reach across the table and grip his hand. This is going to cost you, she said. Not just money for lawyers, though there'll be that. It's going to cost you the peace you've been trying to build here. The quiet, the distance from everything. You're choosing to fight, and fighting means getting involved, risking loss. Are you ready for that? Nate thought about Hannah's face in that photograph, about the way she'd looked at him, like he was capable of being better than he believed. Thought about Hope's eyes when she'd first woken in his cabin, asking if he was real, if safety was possible. I stopped being ready the moment Stryker found them, he said. This stopped being a choice about a mile back. Ellison returned 20 minutes later with news that made the tension in the room ratchet higher. Judge Morrison signed the warrant. State IT is pulling the server records now. We should have the metadata by tonight. He paused. But there's a complication. Kruger must have sensed we'd push back. His lawyer just filed an emergency motion for immediate return of property, claiming you're holding valuable breeding stock that's depreciating in value every day. It's not in proper facilities. When's the hearing? Nate asked. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Morrison will hear both sides and make a ruling. Ellison's expression was grim. The good news is she's the judge. The bad news is without concrete evidence of fraud or cruelty, she'll have to follow the law. And the law says dogs are property. So we have until tomorrow morning to build a case, Charlie said. We have until tonight to get the metadata, Ellison corrected. And we need more. We need something that shows pattern, that proves this wasn't a one-time mistake, but systematic disposal of unwanted animals. Nate stood, walked to the window, looked out at the forest. The graves, he said. Behind the shed, 12 of them. If we can identify even a few of those dogs, connect them to Kruger's breeding records, we prove he's been doing this for years. Ellison nodded slowly. That would work, but it means excavation, forensic recovery. We need the medical examiner, proper documentation, chain of custody for any evidence we find. How fast can it happen? If I call in some favors, we could have a team out there by this afternoon, work through the night if we have to. Ellison pulled out his phone again. But Nate, this is the point of no return. Once we start digging up graves, Kruger's going to know we're coming for him hard. He'll fight back with everything he's got. Good, Nate said. Let him. By 2 p.m., a small team had assembled at the shed site. Deputy Ellison Grant, the county medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chen, 2 evidence technicians from the state police, and a forensic veterinarian Charlie had called in from the University of Michigan. And standing at the edge of the scene, watching with barely concealed rage, Vincent Kruger and his lawyer Mitchell Thorne. You can't stop us from observing a scene on property my client controls, Thorne said when Ellison tried to establish a perimeter. We have every right to witness these proceedings. Fine, Ellison said. Watch, don't touch, don't interfere, and don't contaminate the scene. This is an active investigation. The excavation began carefully, methodically, with the kind of precision usually reserved for human remains. They started with the grave that had the vinyl scrap marked KPK, working slowly to preserve whatever evidence might remain. The first grave yielded a collar leather partially rotted, but still intact. A metal tag dangled from it, engraved letters still readable despite corrosion. Atlas, followed by a microchip number that doctor. Chen photographed from multiple angles before carefully bagging the evidence. The second grave, Dakota. Another collar, another chip number, another piece of the pattern. The third grave held the remains of a bong that couldn't have been more than a year old based on bone development. The collar said Zeus. The microchip said Kruger Premium Kennels. Nate watched Kruger's face as each grave gave up its secrets. Watched the color drain away. Watched the lawyer lean in and whisper urgently. Watched the calculation happening behind those hard eyes as a man realized his carefully constructed lies were coming apart. By the 6th grave, they had enough. 6 identifiable dogs, all registered to Kruger Premium Kennels, all buried in secret behind a property he'd controlled. 6 lives discarded like trash, hidden away, where no one would find them, where the families who'd bought puppies would never know what happened to the breeding stock that produced them. Dr. Chen stood, pulled off her gloves, and turned to Ellison with an expression of barely controlled fury. Based on skeletal development and decomposition rates, these animals died at different times over approximately 3 years. The positioning of remains suggests they were already dead when buried, likely euthanized or killed elsewhere, then transported here for disposal. This isn't a pet cemetery. This is systematic concealment of evidence. Ellison nodded, taking notes, then turned to Kruger. Mr. Kruger, I'm going to need you to come to the station and answer some questions about these animals and their disposition. My client has nothing to say without counsel present. Thorne began, but Kruger was already backing toward his truck, the fight-or-flight response, overriding whatever legal strategy they'd planned. This is harassment, Kruger said, voice rising. You're trying to railroad me because some bleeding heart couldn't mind his own business. Those dogs were sick. They had to be put down. I buried them proper instead of dumping them at the landfill. That's not a crime. Actually, Ellison said quietly, disposing of animals without proper reporting is a crime. And we're just getting started on what else you might have done. Kruger's face went red, then pale. He looked at Nate with pure hatred. This is your fault, he spat. You and that meddling old woman should have just let nature take its course. Nature didn't tie those dogs to posts, Nate said. You did. Prove it. We will, Ellison said. Now, are you coming voluntarily, or do I need to make this official? Thorne put a hand on Kruger's arm, spoke quietly. After a tense moment, Kruger shook him off and stalked to his truck. We'll follow you to the station, Thorne said, and my client will not be answering questions tonight. We'll see you in court tomorrow morning, where this circus will end and the law will actually be followed. They drove away, leaving the excavation team to finish their grim work, and Nate standing in the cold feeling the weight of what they'd uncovered. Charlie approached her face drawn but determined. 6 dogs, she said quietly. 6 families who bought puppies from him who thought they were supporting a reputable breeder. I wonder if any of them know their dogs came from parents who ended up in unmarked graves. We'll find out, Nate said. The microchip database will have owner information. We can trace the puppies, contact the families, build a picture of exactly what Kruger was doing. By the time they returned to the cabin exhausted and cold, night had fallen and news was waiting. Ellison called at 8 p.m. Got the metadata, he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. The wildlife release form was created on December 18th at 11:43 p.m., 3 days after you rescued those dogs. It's a fake backdated to cover his tracks after he realized you weren't going to just let this go. Is it enough? Nate asked. Combined with the graves, the microchip records, and Dr. Chen's testimony about systematic disposal. Yeah, it's enough to prove consciousness of guilt and establish pattern. Morrison will see through Kruger's story. And the dogs should be safe. I'm recommending emergency protective custody pending the outcome of criminal charges. Once we file those formally, Kruger won't be able to touch them. Nate felt something in his chest unclench. Not relief exactly, but the first suggestion that maybe possibly justice might actually happen. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow's hearing is going to be ugly. Kruger knows he's cornered, and cornered animals are dangerous. Be ready for anything. The hearing the next morning was indeed ugly, but not in the way Ellison had predicted. They gathered in Judge Helen Morrison's courtroom at 9 a.m. sharp. Morrison herself was 63, gray hair, pulled back severely, eyes sharp behind reading glasses with the kind of presence that made even lawyers lower their voices in her presence. She listened to Thorne's arguments for immediate return of property. Listened to Ellison present the evidence, the metadata, the graves, the microchip records, Dr. Chen's testimony about systematic disposal. Listened to Charlie's veterinary assessment of the 3 dogs' condition when found. And then she stopped listening to lawyers and started talking to Kruger directly. Mr. Kruger, she said, and her voice could have frozen water. I've reviewed the evidence presented. I've seen the photographs of how these animals were found. I've read the metadata analysis proving you created a false document to cover your actions. I've examined the microchip records of 6 dogs buried on your property without proper reporting. She leaned forward. Do you have anything to say for yourself? And I mean you, not your lawyer. Kruger sat silent, his lawyer having finally convinced him that speaking would only make things catastrophically worse. Morrison's expression hardened into something that looked like controlled rage. Very well. By the authority vested in me by the state of Michigan, I am issuing an immediate and permanent protective order, removing the 3 German Shepherds currently designated as Commander Mercy and Hope from your ownership. They are hereby placed under the permanent guardianship of Nathaniel Briggs. The gavel came down once sharp as a gunshot. Baume. Furthermore, you are prohibited from owning, possessing, or residing with any animal for a period of 15 years. You are fined $25,000 payable to the County Animal Welfare Fund within 30 days. And you will complete 200 hours of community service at an animal shelter to be designated by this court. The gavel came down again. I am also referring this matter to the State Attorney General for criminal prosecution on charges of animal cruelty, fraudulent filing of official documents, and illegal disposal of animal remains. Counselor, she looked at Thorne, I suggest you advise your client to consider a plea agreement, because if this goes to trial, I will personally ensure every news outlet in Michigan knows exactly what kind of man he is. One final strike of the gavel. This court is adjourned. Mr. Kruger, get out of my courtroom. Outside on the courthouse steps, Nate stood in winter sunlight that felt warmer than it should. Charlie stood beside him, and for the first time in 7 years, she was smiling with something that looked like genuine peace. Richard would have loved to see this, she said softly. He did see it, Nate replied. Through you. You never stopped fighting. Neither did you. You could have called animal control and walked away. Instead, you chose to stand. They returned to the cabin to find an unexpected visitor waiting. A young man, thin and unshaven, hands shaking slightly as he stood by a battered Honda Civic, looking uncertain about whether he should stay or leave. Linda Parrish was with him, her hand on his shoulder in a way that was both supportive and restraining. Nate, Linda said as they approached, this is my son Garrett. He just got home. Garrett Parrish was 37 but looked older, the kind of older that came from seeing things that aged you from the inside out. His eyes were tired, distant, like he was looking at the world through glass he couldn't quite break through. Garrett served in the army, Linda continued, and there was careful neutrality in her voice. Infantry, Iraq. He's been home 19 months now, but it's been difficult. The VA doctors say he needs purpose therapy, something to focus on besides the memories. I thought maybe he could help here if you're willing. Nate looked at Garrett and recognized everything he saw. The hollow expression of someone who'd come home but left part of himself in a war zone. The careful control that suggested volatility just beneath the surface. The way his eyes tracked movement, cataloged threats, never fully settled. Nate had worn that same face for months after Hannah died. You know how to use a hammer? Nate asked. Garrett nodded once wary. Good. We need to build proper kennels. Not just for these three, but for others that'll come. Can you handle that? Something flickered in Garrett's expression. Surprise, maybe. Or the first fragile suggestion of hope. Yes, sir. Don't call me sir. I'm Nate. This is Striker Commander Mercy and Hope. They don't care about rank, just consistency. Garrett's eyes went to the dogs visible through the cabin window, and for the first time since arriving, his expression softened. I can do that, he said quietly. Then you start tomorrow, 7 a.m. Bring work gloves and dress warm. Linda's face did something complicated, relief and gratitude and fear, all mixed together, and she gripped Nate's arm briefly before guiding Garrett back to her car. As they drove away, Charlie came to stand beside Nate. You just took on another rescue, she observed. Yeah, seems to be a pattern. You know what you're doing? Nate watched the Honda disappear down the access road. Not even a little bit, he admitted. But that kid needs purpose as badly as those dogs needed rescue. And sometimes the best way to heal is to help someone else do the same. Garrett showed up the next morning at 6:45 early and anxious in the way of people trying desperately not to fail. Nate put him to work immediately building kennel frames from salvaged lumber, giving him clear tasks with measurable outcomes. And something remarkable happened. When Garrett's hands were occupied with work, when his mind was focused on measurements and cuts, in assembly the tremor that plagued him faded. The distant look in his eyes sharpened into concentration. He didn't speak much, but he worked with the kind of intensity that suggested he was building something more than kennels. He was building a reason to get up tomorrow. By the third day, Mercy had noticed him. The dog who'd been afraid of men who flinched at sudden movements and watched hands too carefully began spending time near where Garrett worked. Not close enough to touch, at first just present. On the fourth day, Garrett took a break, sat on a stack of lumber, and Mercy approached, slowly, carefully, like she was making a decision that required courage. She sat beside him, close enough that their bodies touched. Garrett's hand trembled as he reached out to touch her fur. Hey, girl, he whispered, and his voice cracked. You hurt too. Mercy leaned into his touch, and something in Garrett's face broke open. He bent his head and cried quietly while a scarred dog who understood trauma offered the only comfort she knew how to give. Presence. Nate, watching from the cabin window, felt his own eyes burn. This was what Second Watch Haven was becoming. Not just a rescue for animals, but a place where broken things, people and dogs alike, could begin to mend. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like purpose. Garrett worked every day building kennels with the precision of someone who needed perfection to feel worthy. 3 more dogs arrived, rescues from other failed situations brought by people who'd heard what Nate was doing and wanted to help. Apollo, an elderly shepherd abandoned at a hunting camp. Shadow, young and energetic, surrendered by a family that couldn't keep him. Liberty, seized by Ellison from an abuse case and delivered with paperwork, making her officially Nate's responsibility. The small pack grew. Commander took his role as elder, seriously teaching the younger dogs manners and boundaries. Mercy, slowly healing, became the gentle disciplinarian. Hope blossomed into joy, her recovery complete, her trust absolute. And Stryker remained the spine of the operation, patient and observant, the veteran who knew that safety required eternal vigilance. By late January, they'd rescued and successfully placed 9 dogs in carefully vetted homes. Charlie coordinated the medical care and screening. Linda organized fundraising through local churches. Tom Brennan donated land and materials. Deputy Ellison became an unofficial advocate, steering cases their way. A community was forming around this work, built from nothing more than the decision to care when caring was difficult. One morning in early February, Garrett approached Nate with unusual formality. I wanted to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. Would you consider letting me work here full-time, officially, I mean, as a paid caretaker? I know money's tight and I don't need much. Just enough to get my own place nearby and cover basics. He paused. This is the first thing since Iraq that's made me feel like maybe I'm worth something. I don't want to lose it. Nate had been hoping Garrett would ask. I was going to offer it if you didn't bring it up soon. You've earned it, more than earned it. And honestly, I can't imagine doing this without you now. Garrett's face did something complicated, relief and pride and disbelief all fighting for dominance. Thank you, he said, voice rough. I won't let you down. I know you won't. Now get back to work. We've got 2 new intakes scheduled for this afternoon. The smile that spread across Garrett's face was the first genuine one Nate had seen from him. March arrived with the slow reluctance of a Michigan spring. Snow still covered the ground, but the quality of light had changed, and the birds were returning, filling the mornings with sound that promised warmth eventually. Second Watch Haven had become real. Not just an idea, not just a temporary solution, but an actual operation with infrastructure and protocols, and a small team of people dedicated to making it work. 21 dogs rescued and placed in 2 months. Commander Mercy Hope and Stryker remained as permanent residents, the founding members, the heart of everything. And Nate discovered something that surprised him. He was happy. One morning in early March, Nate found Garrett sitting on the porch at dawn, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the kennels. It was unusual. Garrett typically slept until 7, exhausted from nightmares that still came most nights. You're up early, Nate said, joining him. Garrett smiled, and it reached his eyes this time. Couldn't sleep, but not for the usual reasons. Nate waited, learning that Garrett would talk when ready. I slept through the night, Garrett said quietly. First time in 19 months. No dreams about Fallujah. No waking up thinking I'm still there. I just slept. Woke up because I wanted to see the dogs, not because I was running from something. He looked at Nate, and there were tears in his eyes, but they were good tears. I called my buddy from my unit yesterday, Carlos. First time I've been able to talk to anyone from over there. Told him about this place, about the dogs, about feeling like I'm doing something that matters again. Garrett's voice steadied. He's struggling too. I told him if he ever needs a place to come, we've got room. Nate gripped Garrett's shoulder, felt the solid reality of a young man choosing life over the ghost that haunted him. We've always got room, he said. And watching Garrett sit peacefully in the dawn, Nate understood that Second Watch Haven wasn't just saving dogs. It was saving people too. One evening in mid-March, as the sun set late enough to promise spring, Nate and Charlie sat on the porch steps. The dogs were playing in the yard, supervised by Garrett, who'd learned their personalities better than anyone. You know, Charlie said, Richard used to tell me that life gives you 2 chances at most things. The first chance, you usually mess up because you don't know what you're doing. The second chance, if you're lucky enough to get it, you treasure because you know how rare it is. You think this is a second chance, Nate asked. I think we're both getting one. You're building something that matters. I'm finishing something Richard started, proving that good can come out of grief. We're both learning how to move forward without forgetting what came before. She looked at him, and there was something new in her expression, not romantic exactly, but possibility. The acknowledgement that healing didn't have to be solitary. I'm not replacing Hannah, Charlie said carefully, and you're not replacing Richard. But maybe that's not what second chances are about. Maybe they're about learning there's room for more than one chapter. Nate reached out, took her hand, not a declaration, just an acknowledgement that he wasn't as alone as he'd been, and that maybe eventually that would be more than okay. They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the dogs settled into evening routines. Later that night, Nate was organizing the small office they'd established when he found it. A box he didn't remember packing when he'd moved to Michigan. Old and battered, shoved in the back of a closet. Hannah's handwriting on the lid, Nate's important stuff. He almost didn't open it. Almost put it back, afraid of what memories might be waiting inside. But something made him lift the lid. Inside, mixed with his old dog tags and deployment photos, was a letter. Cream-colored envelope, his name written in Hannah's careful script. Sealed with wax, the way she used to do for special occasions. His hand shook as he opened it. The letter was dated February 1st, 2023, 3 weeks before Hannah died. Nate read it standing there in the small office, tears streaming down his face as Hannah's voice spoke to him across the gulf of death with the clarity and wisdom of someone who'd loved him completely. She wrote about watching him struggle with the transition from military to civilian life, about her worry that when she was gone, and she knew somehow she'd known he would close himself off completely, about her certainty that his calling to serve and protect didn't end with his Navy career, just changed shape. And then in her closing words, she'd written, "My dearest Nate, you were made to protect and serve. That calling doesn't end with military service. It just transforms into something new. When your first watch ends and mine is ending, sooner than either of us wanted, find your second. Find something that needs the man you are, not just the soldier you were. I'm releasing you from the promise we made to grow old together, but I'm binding you to a new promise. Don't let grief make you forget how to live. Don't be afraid to care again. Don't be afraid to build something new, even while you're still grieving what you lost. Find your second watch, my love. And when you do, don't be afraid to stay. Don't be afraid to let others in. Don't be afraid of happiness just because I'm not there to share it with you. I'll be watching. I'll be proud. And I'll be waiting for you to realize that loving me doesn't mean you can't love anything else ever again. Find your second watch and stay on it. Forever yours, Hannah. Nate sank to the floor back against the wall and let himself cry for the first time since her funeral. Not the silent, controlled grief he'd been carrying, but the full weight of loss and love and gratitude for a woman who'd known him better than he knew himself. When the tears finally stopped, he stood, slowly walked to his desk and pulled out paper and pen. His hands shook as he wrote, but the words came easier than expected. Dear Hannah, I found it. You were right, I needed a second watch and I was too scared and angry to look for it. But it found me anyway in a storm through a dog who wouldn't ignore suffering. You asked me not to let grief make me forget how to live. I'm trying. Some days are harder than others. But I'm here. I'm staying. I'm keeping watch over the ones nobody else will. I wish you could see this place. You'd love it. You'd probably have 10 more ideas for improving it, and you'd be right about all of them. You'd love Charlie and Garrett and all these broken dogs who are teaching me that rescue works both ways. I'm not saying goodbye because you're still here in every good choice I make. But I am saying thank you for loving me, for knowing me, for releasing me towards something I couldn't see yet. I'm on second watch now, and I won't abandon my post. Forever yours, Nate. He folded the letter carefully, walked outside to the fire pit they used for evening gatherings. The night was clear and cold stars brilliant overhead. He burned the letter, watched the paper curl and blacken, watched the words rise as smoke into the darkness, carrying his message to wherever Hannah was. It wasn't closure, but it was continuation. A conversation that didn't end with death, just changed forms. He stood there until the last ember faded, then returned to the cabin where 4 dogs waited and where purpose had taken root in the frozen ground of his grief. The official opening of Second Watch Haven was scheduled for March 15th, a Saturday, when the community could gather without conflict. They came out in force. Tom and Linda brought food enough to feed twice the expected crowd. Ellison came in uniform, unofficial endorsement from law enforcement. Sister Margaret offered a blessing. Volunteers who'd helped over the past months arrived with their families wanting to be part of something that mattered. And Charlie stood beside Nate, steady and sure, as Garrett unveiled the sign he'd spent weeks perfecting. Hand-carved oak letters burned deep, Second Watch Haven established. December 2024. For those who need a second chance, Sister Margaret stepped forward, small and formidable, her voice carrying in the cold air. Let us pray. Lord, you forget no creature. You number the sparrows and mark their fall. Today we witness your faithfulness in this place built by grief, transformed into purpose, by loss redeemed through service. Bless these people who have chosen to stand watch over the forgotten. Bless these animals who've learned to trust again. And bless this work that it may grow in grace and mercy. Amen. Amen, the crowd echoed. Nate didn't make a speech. He wasn't good with words, never had been. But he shook hands, accepted congratulations, and felt the weight of community settle over him like something he could carry instead of something crushing him. As people drifted through the kennels meeting the dogs, hearing their stories, a truck pulled up. Older model rust showing through blue paint. A woman climbed out, maybe 40, work-worn and exhausted. She opened the passenger door, carefully lifted out a German shepherd who was clearly suffering. Old, thin, moving with pain that spoke of joints failing and systems shutting down. She approached Nate hesitantly, like she expected to be turned away. I heard you take dogs like this, she said. Dogs nobody else wants. His name's Captain. He's 12, been with my family since he was a pup, but I lost my house last month. Been living in my truck. I can't give him what he needs anymore. Her voice broke. I called every shelter within 100 miles. They all said, he's too old, too sick, medical costs too high. You're my last hope. If you can't take him. She couldn't finish the sentence. Nate looked at the old dog, saw the dignity. There, even in decline, saw the love between woman and animal being torn apart by circumstances beyond her control. He knelt, let Captain sniff his hand. The old dog's tail moved slightly, and his eyes held intelligence and kindness despite the pain. We'll take him, Nate said, and we'll make sure he's comfortable. Whatever time he has left, it'll be good time. You have my word. The woman's face crumpled with relief and grief tangled together. Thank you, God. Thank you. Can I, can I visit him? Anytime, Nate said. He'll always know you love him. Charlie was already moving forward with the carrier Garrett stepping up to help transfer Captain Gently. And as Nate watched his team work, because that's what they'd become a team, he felt Hannah's presence like warmth on cold skin. This was what she'd meant. This was the second watch. Not glory, not recognition, just showing up when darkness fell and others had given up, because that's what it meant to be faithful to something larger than yourself. The woman drove away, crying relieved and heartbroken, and Captain settled into the kennel Garrett had prepared with Commander, immediately taking position beside him. Old soldiers recognizing each other. Nate stood in the doorway watching, and Charlie approached quietly. That's what we do here, isn't it? She said. The ones nobody else wants. The ones that are too broken, too old, too damaged. The second chances when the first ones run out. Yeah, Nate agreed. That's exactly what we do. She slipped her hand into his. He didn't pull away. They stood together watching the points settle, watching Garrett move among them with competence and care, watching something small and fragile become something that might actually last. That night, after the crowd had gone and the kennels were quiet, Nate did his final rounds, checking locks, ensuring water dishes were full, speaking quietly to each dog by name. When he reached Hope's kennels, he was awake, watching him with eyes that held complete trust, now no question remaining. Hey girl, he said softly. Remember when you weren't sure if I was real? When you didn't know if I'd stay? Hope's tail thumped against the floor. I'm staying, Nate said. This is my second watch, and I don't abandon my post. He returned to the cabin where Stryker waited by the door, patient and eternal. The photograph of Hannah still sat on the table, but it didn't hurt to look at anymore. She was smiling at him across years and loss, and he could smile back now. He picked up the frame, ran his thumb across the glass one last time. I found it, he told her. My second watch. You were right about everything. He set the photo down, gently walked to the window, and looked out at the kennels glowing softly in the darkness. 13 dogs slept safe and warm. 13 lives saved. 13 second chances. Tomorrow there would be more, because the watch never ended. It just kept going. One dog at a time, one person at a time, one act of stubborn mercy at a time. Nathaniel Briggs had learned the hard way that some missions didn't end with victory, parades, or medals. Some missions were just showing up every day, doing the work nobody noticed, keeping watch when it was dark and cold and lonely. But those missions mattered most. Those missions saved lives, including his own. And as he stood there in the quiet cabin with purpose humming through his veins instead of grief, he understood something Hannah had tried to tell him all along. Healing didn't mean forgetting. Moving forward didn't mean leaving behind. And loving what you'd lost didn't prevent you from loving what you'd found. The second watch had begun, and it would not end.